Aldridge, page 149. It's the button opening. So she's calling it standard button front. In this case, she has a block that has an underarm dart, so I've chosen this one. Now we have a dart here as well, and she doesn't. That doesn't matter. Okay. The main thing is we don't have anything up here in the shoulder. So I'm going to read through again. Hopefully I can interpret her language if it needs interpreting. Mark the buttonholes on the center front line is her first line, so straight in there, very little explaining. Buttonholes overlap this line by 0.2 centimeter she has in brackets. Add a button stand approximately 2.5 centimeters. This varies with size of buttons. And then mark in the facing line, which is this dotted line here. She has it written in, facing line. Fold over the outer line. So she's telling us to fold over. I'm not going to do actually exactly what she does there, so I'm going to skip that line and then unfold and trace off. So this piece here is like a piece as if we added extra on and we folded it back. So you always need extra behind for the buttons. So if you look at it, there's always something there that's folded back. It's a facing of some sort. With a button band, you'd have the extra piece behind it, but there's always something. So that's what she's talking about there in terms of the facing. And we will do that. We will do a facing. We'll trace it off slightly different. So there is a lot of theory about buttons, and I'll go through a little bit. In terms of button stand, she has said in her book that it varies depending on the size of the button. Buttons always sit right on the center front line. Okay, if they were slightly off, it would be really weird. You'd notice it straight away. Buttons are down the middle, down the center of a garment, and they are always down the center. But the center, if I draw a button here, if I want like a button, it's like it's hanging off the edge of the garment, isn't it? So you have to add this extra bit to the garment called a button stand, so that the button is actually on fabric. Do you know? Now the amount that you add on that button stand depends on the size of the button, as she said. So bigger button, bigger stand or allowance. Yeah. If it was menswear and we were doing a shirt, we'd only need a very small amount of button allowance because we'd only have a small button, and then we could only just need maybe 1 centimeter. All right. But in this case, we're not. We're doing bigger buttons. So it's women's wear, and we're doing a bit larger button. So if we do a larger button, we need more button stand. But that's generally speaking what you want to know about button stand. You also want to know that there's 2 names for it: button stand or button allowance. The next bit of information is how do you space them? There is standard spacing. For women's wear, it's 8 centimeters on a shirt. Okay, for men, it might be more like 9 to 10 centimeters on the shirt. That's for blouses and shirts. So coats would have the spacing wider generally. So coats could be 10 to 12 to 15, you know, anything like that could be spaced quite far apart. Where you put the button depends on whether the garment has a collar or not. If there is a collar, there is a button generally speaking on the collar, not always, but so if there's a collar that has a button, you start your first button, generally speaking, 4 centimeters down from it. In the case here, it's not that way. Because this is a very formal, expensive blouse. This is silk, and it's a very formal blouse. And if you have a very formal blouse or shirt in menswear, you will have the button here. So the more casual men's shirt will have a button 4 centimeters down after their first button. Same with the women's. And then the important thing to know, one of the most important things about buttons is the direction. So you have this direction versus this direction. And why would we have a choice of this and this? Typically, The top one is horizontal because it's holding the pressure of the collar or the opening. So you just come out on this one, 2.5 all along. And you add it along the front. Is 2.5 full scale. So in half scale, 1.25 out here. Sometimes I think it's really good to draw a button on. I think that's the best thing because when you're learning, because if you draw a button on, you kind of understand what's happening and the placement. You can just sketch it. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything. It's just a light sketch. So that's like a large button. But the thing is, on horizontal buttons, the button goes in the hole and then goes over to the side. You see? So on this one, it goes in, but it sits at the side. You see the buttonhole is all over there to the left and the button is there. So our buttonhole has to be here. The center of the button has to sit on the center front. So our hole has to start here and go this direction. And that button is 3 centimeters in full scale. So that could be 1.5 for you guys. And so the buttonhole has to be the 3 centimeters. In this case, I came down 2 centimeters full scale, 1 for you in half scale. And then starting the buttonhole on the center front and going to the left, that's then 3 centimeters in width for the button. It's just a little more in the buttons than we think. So the next thing is the spacing. So the thing is, you could measure down, say you're 8 centimeters and just see how it works out. I often do this. I kind of go, okay, 8, 8, and 8. That doesn't look great though, because the last one is very high up above the bottom of the garment, you know. I know in her picture it's a bit up, so, we have 4 in our diagram. But I think I'll just space it 9, just to be a little bit further so that bottom one comes down a bit. So I often do that. I'll go and just put a little dot and then check the spacing. Does that look right? And I can change it a bit because 8 is the standard, but we don't have to stick to that. It could be 8.5, it could be 8.375, it could be 9. There's a bit of room to move. The more important thing is that the buttons are placed well on your garment. So I'm going to go ahead and come down 9 and see how I feel about that. It has a big knock on, so sometimes they change it to 9 and I think, oh, it's too low. Now I'll go to 8.5. I like that better. I like the 9 spacing better. It looks better to me. So 4.5 for you guys in half scale. Yeah, we can have 4 buttons. 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks more close to the picture. It looks better spacing at the bottom. There's a little bit of space, but it matches my flat drawing that I'm working from. Then the width, the button measurement is 3 full scale. Connect the top and the bottom nicely. So the last thing that we're going to do on this is to draw facing in. It's a simple thing to do in terms of it's just a line that we're drawing, that dotted line that's on the diagram there. And that line is how to find that line. You come 5 centimeters back, that's full scale, on the shoulder and from the center front line as well. So I've come 5 there, 5 there, and 5 there, and now I'm just gonna blend a line from there down through that. So I usually start with drawing a straight line and then coming from this point down to meet it somewhere, and a slight curve. Now, facing being something that goes behind the garment, we shade it in. So shading it in looks like this. No measurements or anything on those lines, it's just lines drawn across it. When you do that, you can pick it out really easily. And anything that has shading, which is these diagonal lines, means that it goes behind the garment. It's not on the front of the garment. Okay, so that's the bodice piece. That's what it looks like that. It needs its labeling and seam allowance, but that's the basic trace off. Okay, so here you have the two trace-offs in their basic form, the bodice itself, and then the little piece here, the facing that goes behind. So here's an example of a blouse with the button front that has a facing. All right, and here's another one that has that button front and has a facing on the inside. So this needs then its labeling and seam allowance and all that. So the labeling, your name or your initials there, and then this, we call it a button front. So the garment is a button front blouse. The part of the garment that this is the third label. The part of the garment is just the front. And then we're cutting two because it's opening. And we have two sides. The facing labels are very similar. It just says front facing. So in this one, I suppose we could call this the front bodice, just to differentiate it from the facing. And this one, there's no fold or anything, so there is seam allowance right the way around it. Remember when you're putting on the 1.5 around to always extend all of your lines through the seam allowance. So the thing about this facing pattern piece is that this side here doesn't actually sew to anything. So you don't actually put seam allowance on there. So on blouses like this, there is nothing it's sewing to. You can see that the edge is just overlocked and it's just left. And then you add your 4 centimeters at the bottom, and the fishtailing on this is important, and it does look a little peculiar, but so I always draw in my line. So that's 4 centimeters down. For you guys that would be 2. I draw in the line here first before I draw anything on those sides, and then I fold it up, because essentially you're also having to transfer the shape of this dart. So when you're tracing the fishtail here on the side, you're also tracing through this shape. So you see the way that looks at the hem? this shape here has to come back, has to be reflected, because that's going to fold behind it, so it has to match that. And the same, this is quite an angled line at this side, so they need to be fishtail. This is all 90-degree angles, so if you fishtail, you'll find they just fall right on the same spot. So you can just draw that down.